possibilities of confiscation of frozen Russian assets. This is a topic which is not discussed enough, and unfortunately, its importance is ever rising given the current difficulties of Ukraine to obtain funding for the next year. We have with us several panelists who have done research on this topic and have very interesting findings to discuss, and they actually see this is a spoiler, they see real possibilities for confiscating of frozen Russian assets. I'm very pleased to welcome Andriy Mikheyev. He is an international law expert at the Center for Ukrainian Victory in Kiev. And Maxim Kuzhdin, he also represents Ukraine. He is an analyst at the Center for Economic Strategy in Kiev. They both co-authored a study exploring possibilities of confiscating frozen Russian assets, and will discuss the main results of that study here with us. And I'm very pleased to welcome Martin Sandbu, who is economics commentator from the Financial Times. He has been writing extensively on the topic of Ukraine over recent years, and especially the topic of financing of confiscating of Russian frozen assets. This has also been one of the topics of interest of Martin, and he has some valuable perspectives to share with us. And I would like first to give floor to our Ukrainian colleagues. Andriy Mikheyev, please. He will talk about the legal arguments for the confiscation of Russian frozen assets. I don't want to spend too much time talking, so the floor is yours, please.
Hi, Olga. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity provided to have a word, have a speech on this webinar among the professionals and among the experts who may really influence the decisions in their states regarding use of the confiscated, I'm looking forward to future regarding the frozen Russian sovereign assets, Russian central bank assets. So, as you have, Olga, as you have mentioned, me and Maxim presented here together with the International Center for Ukrainian Victory board member Olena Galushka and other pool of authors. We together made a study on the current possibilities to make the confiscation of Russian assets and address them to the assistance to Ukraine possible. The main idea of this study is not just that such confiscation is not just possible due to the political will of Ukrainian partner states, but also it is completely legitimate from the viewpoint of international law, and all the counter arguments as for the economic impact of such confiscation are also not so strong, and they may be overcome. So as a lawyer, I will currently speak about the legal reasons, the legal arguments on confiscation of Russian assets from the viewpoint of international law. First of all, of course, confiscation of assets is completely possible to be implemented as the countermeasure of states of Ukraine as an injured state, a state injured by the aggression and by violation of international law, and by third states. Such states have such a legitimate right to impose countermeasure against violator of international law, as Russia is, obviously, and apply measures until I'm sorry, can you still until
it's all fine.
Yeah, and may apply until the violator ceases such violation of international law. Actually, those measures which have been already applied, such as freezing Russian assets, they have also all features of the countermeasures. But unfortunately, they appeared not to be as effective as such states counted for. Russia still continues its war. It has all the budget. It has all the loopholes to avoid sanctions. And since 2014, such sanctions, including freezing sovereign assets, appeared not to be effective at all, unfortunately. So the new countermeasures applied should correspond to the requirements to such countermeasures. They should be proportional to the inflicted damages, and also they should be and also the main counter argument regarding application of countermeasures, that such countermeasures should be temporary character, and they should be easily removed after the violator ceases violation of international law. And of course, it looks on the first look, it looks rather surprising. It looks like impossible. Okay, how may confiscation of assets be reversible? How can it be temporary when you take someone's money and spend for some purposes? It may be because the obligation of Russia as a perpetrator here is not just to stop aggression, it's also to pay all the reparations for the damages caused. And it's possible up to negotiations to make the mechanism when Russia prospectively, theoretically seizes such violation, and such assets may be returned to it for after the reparations are paid, or, which is more likely, using of such assets may be netted in account of paying reparation in form of compensation by Russian Federation. So actually, countermeasures is the main institute of international law which shall be effective here. Of course, one may say, okay, but we have the sovereign immunity concept, the sovereign immunity of states and their property, and which may not be overcome, and it's also contained in international law. But we should understand that sovereign immunity is based on the international customary law rules, as well as the countermeasures and responsibilities of states for the internationally wrongful acts. They are totally equal. Responsibility of states is reflected in the articles, UN articles on responsibility of states for the internationally wrongful acts. Why the sovereign immunity is also based on the international customs and is confirmed by the practice of International Court of Justice, by international investment tribunals, and so on. These two institutions are not codified in any active, effective, and universal international conventions, actually, and they are equal and should be applied considering the circumstances and considering the nature of the violation committed. Another legal argument is that actually sovereign immunity, which is considered as the main barrier to confiscation of state assets, it applies only to confiscation, alienation, and seizure through the court decisions. If we're talking about confiscation through executive decision of the government, it's not covered by such international custom as sovereign immunity. Of course, it looks rather like, on the first look, it looks rather doubtful, as this is an approach like, okay, it's not written, it's literally not written in there and there and there. There's no such practice, so that does not really mean that sovereign immunity is not applied to the so-called executive confiscation, as the court procedure provides more protection and more protection of procedural rights for the states than executive decisions of the government. Yes, such an argument, it would be right, and it's like the main argument of the opponents of such confiscation. But we also should understand that there is that the absence of executive confiscation in the scope of sovereign immunity is not the only reason. We also have other examples of executive measures applied by states regarding the foreign states and the foreign investors, such as nationalization, such as expropriation and of property. It may be conducted by executive decisions of governments, even in peaceful times, for the public purposes, of course, with the due procedure, but without any war, without any acts of aggression, and without any war crimes. Of course, such actions should be compensable. The previous owner should be subject to compensation, but we are not talking right now about the differences between these institutions. We only talk that executive measures on alienation of property, they are already existing in international law. They are mutually recognized by states. And the only issue which is raised by international tribunals regarding them is, are such actions subject to compensation or not, but not about their legitimacy. So executive measures are completely are possible, which is proved by the state practice. And we should also understand that application of countermeasures, as well as the executive confiscation on the national level, they should not be considered separately. It's not like two options. They are like connected with each other. Actually, the executive confiscation of national level is the implementation of the countermeasures applied according to the international law. These countermeasures may be reflected, for instance, in international agreement or in declaration, and after that, states participating in it adopt national laws or bylaws which allow them to implement such countermeasures. As you know, the current version of the Repo Act, which is going through the US Congress now, it's in its preamble, it has complete reference to the countermeasures applied to the Russian Federation for the violation of international law. And to my opinion, that would be the ideal model for the same national acts which may be adopted in the European Union states. And that such actions from the Union are very important because the majority of money, the majority of confiscated assets are actually placed in the European Union, not in Canada. So the decisive actions are very necessary from the EU side. And the last argument, I'm very sorry, maybe I'm speaking too long, but it's the last legal argument, is that according to Article 51 of the UN Charter, such actions as confiscation, such measures would be the act of self-defense, as the Russian Federation and its aggression has the great economic impact on Ukraine. It has destroyed infrastructure, residential houses, destroyed, make a lot of material losses, and the agricultural sector. So the Ukrainian economy is currently completely smashed and destroyed, and the losses of GDP are catastrophic. And until aggression stops, they would be more and more and more. And we already have the same precedents in international law when self-defense was applied not in direct manner like the direct military reactions, but also as military assistance, which is currently provided by our Ukrainian distinguished partners. It's also participation in self-defense, and as well economic measures regarding the aggressor, as they were justified during the UK-Argentina military conflict for the Falkland Islands. To make the long story short and to sum everything up, confiscation is not just confiscation is not just it's not just a political issue, and it will not just be something states like should take some very hard decisions about. It may be completely legally justified. I'm hoping that I have provided a lot of convincing arguments to you as why it is completely legitimate from the viewpoint of international law. It should be the countermeasure applied by Ukraine and its partners, reflected at the national level by the executive confiscation laws or bylaws, and act of self-defense as an additional argument would also assist very much in this issue. So thank you very much. And I would like, as far as I understand, as we are talking about the our study, I think I may pass the floor to the
let me just
authors.
thank you so much. I just wanted to mention thank you. You provided, I must say, very convincing arguments why confiscation of Russian assets should be legally possible and feasible. But still, the issues probably are even more dimensional. From what I understand as an economist, there are some economic concerns of what it would mean for the international financial system apart from the legal side of it. And I would like to pass the floor to Maxim, who will guide us through the economic arguments here, why this is, in his opinion, not the case. And I also wanted to remind you about the housekeeping. So if you have questions, please leave them in the Q&A. And after the exchange between panelists, I will be really happy to ask them. Thank you, Maxim. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Ola, and thank you, Andriy. Let me just start sharing my screen real quick. Okay. Is this okay visible? Perfect. Thank you, Andriy. We were absolutely thrilled at the Center for Economic Strategy to collaborate with the International Center for Ukrainian Victory on this study, and I am happy to present the economic arguments for confiscation of Russian state assets in favor of Ukraine. The main argument that we keep hearing over and over is that the confiscation of assets will create a trickle-down effect in which a lot of other countries, especially non-democratic authoritarian countries, will withdraw their assets from the Western financial systems, thus leading to the collapse of the financial systems of the West, which would obviously be less than ideal. But at the same time, we believe that such fears are absolutely unfounded and that there are no alternatives to the Western financial systems, and the world is very unlikely to shift away from storing money in Western countries. At the same time, Ukraine has suffered significant losses. As I'm sure you all are aware, in March of this year, the World Bank has estimated the damages to Ukraine at 411 billion, and since then, obviously, the number has only gone up. Only the Kakhovka Dam damages are estimated at $14 additional billion. So that is a significant amount of money, which can be at least partially compensated with the about 300 billion euros that are being currently kept in the European Union of the frozen Russian assets. In order to fully explore the arguments, let us first look at the composition of the world's foreign exchange reserves, because the biggest argument is that if we freeze the Russian foreign exchange reserves, the other countries will take their foreign exchange reserves away and try to relocate them away from Europe, the US, and the G7 countries. Currently, we have calculated, as defined by the Economist Democracy Index, all the authoritarian countries collectively hold about 40% of the world's foreign exchange reserves. And here on the graph, you can see the countries being plotted by the size of the foreign exchange reserves, with China being the largest one. But also on the scale, they are plotted by the World Bank's Voice and Accountability estimate. And this estimate basically tries to account for all the democratic freedoms that citizens of a particular country have. The estimate varies from -2.5, ranges from -2.5 to 2.5. And you can see that the truly democratic countries with the index of above 0.5 on the very right in the green color only collectively hold about a third of all the foreign exchange reserves, meaning the rest of the world, the non-democratic countries, basically hold the majority. At the same time, when we look at the split of the currencies in the global reserves, we see that the four main Western currencies, the US dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, and the British pound, collectively hold 89.2% of all the reserves, meaning even the non-democratic countries still keep their money in the West, just because of the stability that the democratic regimes can provide. Obviously, the split slightly differs by the country, so less democratic countries will usually tend to have a slightly bigger proportion of the reserves kept in other currency, non-Western currencies, but the general trend is pretty convincing. At this point of time, there is absolutely no alternative to the Western markets. A lot of other countries, mainly big economic superpowers, have tried and attempted to attract the funds of foreign countries and turn their own currencies into the reserve currencies, with the most notable example being China. However, as we can see, China only has ever had about 3% in share of the total from the global reserves, and it never even crossed the 3% mark. As a lot of economist commentators thought, the freezing of the Russian assets by the West will lead naturally other countries to flock to China or other non-democratic countries and store their foreign reserves there. However, as we can see on the graph, this absolutely did not happen, and the Chinese renminbi actually fell in the total share of the reserves. This is due to many reasons. First of all, China is unable to compete with Western currencies because it weaponizes yuan and often manipulates currency artificially. Back in 2018, it was even designated as a currency manipulator by the United States, although that label was dropped in 2020. But basically, renminbi is being used in trade wars quite a lot. There is lack of full convertibility because there exists a so-called overseas renminbi and the local renminbi, which are not the same. They are regulated differently, and the spread can sometimes reach 1-2%, which is obviously not ideal for investors. And China is also has a record of being very unsafe for private investments. Notably because in 2021 it has passed an anti-foreign sanctions law, which basically allows the government to seize private property of private foreign investors without much notice. All of this basically indicates that China is very unlikely to gain traction and promote its currency and actually be successful in making renminbi a reserve currency. Several other notable examples of countries who have tried or at least expressed ambition to make their currency reserve are India. This, however, remains very unrealistic because Indian rupee remains volatile. Even Russia, who is now forced to switch to other currencies, is struggling and does not show desire to adopt Indian rupee, calling it too volatile. And also the problem is that Indian economy, although growing fast, is still relatively small, only accounts for 2% of global exports, and therefore other countries do not feel compelled to hold rupees just because of the low amount of exports. Russia, of course, this is a bit of a laughable example at this point, but they have tried to make ruble a reserve currency. We all know what happened to ruble since the start of the invasion. It has plummeted over 40%, and that doesn't seem to be the rock bottom. So Russian ruble very unlikely to ever become reserve currency in the near future. One threat that experts talk a lot about is the BRICS currency that has been in talks for many years. However, we believe that it is unlikely to ever gain traction, especially after the expansion, just because of the sheer diversity in the geopolitical interests of the members. We can see that, for example, Brazil is much more oriented towards the United States, while other countries might be oriented towards China. So it is very hard to imagine that those countries will just give up their monetary sovereignty and in any way submit to the common currency, which will likely be dominated by China as an economic superpower anyway. Another argument is that countries, instead of changing the currency for their reserves, might just withdraw and channel their reserves into gold. This, however, is also highly unlikely. First of all, gold is very, very volatile. The short-term volatility can reach 15-20%, and that's extremely high. It also has extremely high transaction costs, and a few countries like Russia and Venezuela have actually tried to withdraw the physical gold within their borders. However, this possesses a lot of challenges. primarily logistical. It is really expensive to transfer gold across borders and then trade that gold. So those countries basically become encaged in their golden cages, as it is said. And also there is the problem of just like not having physically enough gold in the world, because once again, as per the Economist Democracy Index, the authoritarian countries collectively hold $5.3 trillion in reserve. However, we only have about 36,000 tons of gold physically in the custody of central banks all over the world, which amounts to about 2.1 trillion, which is obviously not enough. There are definitely going to be challenges ahead when it comes to confiscation, legal challenges about which Andriy has talked a little, and I really encourage you to read both parts of our study on the website of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. But in terms of economic risks, the only real economic risk that we can foresee is the flow of foreign reserves between Western countries. So, for example, if Europe unilaterally implement sanctions or confiscates Russian assets, other countries might just flock their investments towards the US, Japan, etc. So this can lead to de-dollarization or de-eurization. However, this has a very simple solution, which lies in coordination of actions between the European Union and the G7 countries. We believe that this is absolutely possible considering the unprecedented support for Ukraine that Western countries have provided. And we believe that this swift action will allow to confiscate and the funds of Russia and restore justice by allowing Ukraine to rebuild itself and prosper in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maxim. Yeah, the arguments on international foreign reserves, they do make sense. I think also the stress on the near future is quite important here, because at the moment the situation is quite beneficial, but it might change. And in terms of unity of the West and coordination, this might also change given an outcome of a presidential elections in the US, which we are not wishing for. But I would like now to pass the floor to Martin, and please give us your side, your comments. Do you see from your perspective, from your experience, the arguments as convincing? And yeah, what are the possible caveats? What are the problems which we might see, haven't talked about so far?
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the hosts for having me, and thanks very much to Andriy and Maxim for their presentations. I'd like to start by just kind of commending you on the studies you've done, and recommend to everyone who's watching to take a look at them. They have the extreme virtue of being short, which is very useful in a debate that's really kind of it's a bit hindered by all the complexities and technicalities of this. As somebody who's not a lawyer, and I've had to read through sort of long legal briefs about this to try to understand it, there's a big value for policymakers and for ordinary citizens to have these short papers that, in my view, cover everything in very succinct terms. So I think both parts of the study are very useful sort of first entry points for those who are new to this debate, or at least are new to trying to understand the issues. All the arguments are there, and they're good springboards for those who want to go into more detail and look more at the detailed arguments, whether legal or economic. I mean, I think it's really important to do this, to cut through a little bit the paralysis that we get into with all the technicalities and the complexities. And I say that because this has been going on now for, how long is it? 21 months. Basically, this debate started as soon as the first action to block the foreign exchange reserves of the Russian central bank. And let me make one little pedantic point here. My understanding is that if we want to be technically correct, we should not call them frozen, because these are not targeted with the same sort of legislation as you do to freeze private assets, oligarchs' assets. What all Western countries have done is to introduce a prohibition for their residents to manage funds for the Russian central bank. So there's this is why they say they've been immobilized or blocked. In practice, it probably means the same thing. These funds can't move, but it has some, it makes some things a little bit more complicated. And the reason why this happened in the first place was because of sovereign immunity worries. So the kind of the concern was brought in at the very start, and that's one reason why we haven't got very far. Now, in those 21 months, I think we have moved from something that was a genuine kind of legal concern. Is this compatible? Would confiscation be compatible with international law? To something that I think is a little bit of a cover, really, for what are political concerns. So I think by now the real obstacles are political will and political decision making. It's become a policy question camouflaging as a legal question. Not because there aren't important legal arguments to be had, but we've had all these arguments. And the study shows that, all the arguments are now on the table, and they've been there for pretty much a year, among the experts at least. If Western governments were really in the position that they would morally and politically really like to confiscate, but they have legal doubts, we would have seen them behave differently. They would have done everything they could to set up the possible structures to do this, to prepare legislation to do this, which only a few have done. And above all, something that neither of the colleagues mentioned, they would have published the numbers, or at least been much more transparent about how much the Russian central bank holds in which jurisdiction and in what form. And here, journalists like me have had to, make calls, nag people, not get answers, try to calculate things from public data. It's been very, very hard. We still don't have a complete picture. But to me, this is a sign that there is something not quite honest going on in terms of the justifications we hear. Now, that doesn't mean we can ignore the legal stuff. That means we have to do the legal stuff, like Andrei did. And we have to think about the sort of policy considerations, a lot of which have to do with the economy. So that's where Maxim's work is relevant. But we have to do both, and I think we have to be very clear that at the political level now, the legal debate is in a sense complete. Everything we need to know and say is there. Now is the time for decision making. I want to. I don't really have anything to add to Andrei's legal analysis. It has everything that's been out there. I think the countermeasures doctrine. We can do this in order to counteract another breach of international law. That's well established. The other argument about self-defense I've heard used much less, so it's good that that comes up. And I find particularly useful the explanation of why they need to be reversible if you do a countermeasure is not an argument against confiscation. So this was the thing that was the most kind of new to me. I hadn't thought enough about it myself. Andrei's point that one of the obligations, Russian obligations we're kind of trying to enforce here is to pay compensation, not just to stop the war, but to undo the damage to the extent it can be done, materially at least. And that means that there's no incompatibility with confiscating for the purpose of paying for reconstruction. And that's what we're always talking about. It's not just taking the money, it's using it for that purpose. And a countermeasures argument for why we're doing this and why it's legal. And that brings me to a political point I wanted to make, kind of moving on from the legal part. It's not, I don't think everyone appreciates what the current political policy stance of the Western coalition is, the G7, if you like. G7 leaders have now twice said, we are not going to unblock Russia's access to its foreign exchange reserves in our jurisdictions until Russia pays compensation. That is the stated policy at the top political level of the West. So in a sense, the only thing we're talking about here is, should we force that compensation to take place now? Or should we wait until, well, some undefined point, presumably after some peace negotiations or armistice negotiations? But once you appreciate that we've already said that Russia will not get this money back or will not get access to it back until compensation is paid, in a sense, to me, it seems like the question becomes quite a lot simpler, certainly legally. Also, however, it confirms my worries in that if we're willing to say we'll hold on to it indefinitely, but we're not willing to actually make use of it now, force the compensation to happen now, I sense that maybe that commitment is not entirely 100% watertight, that there's a time consistency problem here. So what I worry about is the day there is some sort of solution to the actual hot war, and hopefully a good one, but some form of negotiation or deal or armistice or whatever it is. After that, I fear that you will start to hear more vocally the voices in the West who will say, this is not a point to punish Russia. This is not a point to risk further destabilizing of the Russian regime. Or, if this isn't a new Russian regime, here we have to help them build democracy. You can think of all kinds of reasons, or we can think of a new president in the US where this commitment turns out not to be a strong commitment. So that to me is a political reason to act quite soon on transforming the current political position into actual action. The final point on law. So the lawyers have to debate what the law says, but as citizens, we shouldn't forget that the law is not something that's handed down on stone tablets from on high in a permanent way. We make the law, people make the law. And if the law is inadequate, we should change the law. International law as we know it in the post-1945 world was built in 1945 in part, right? So what we do now, it's very true that it has precedent, and that's precisely a reason to actually make policy. So I think one important point for non-lawyers to engage with is that we as citizens need to think about what sort of legal order is it we want to defend. Is it one where aggressors and those who commit crimes against humanity and crimes of war can rely on the same legal order they violated to protect their property? Or is it one where that property can itself be, in this case, confiscated as a way to enforce or punish or end the much worse deviations or breaches of international law that Russia has committed? I think this is for citizens and for policymakers and for everyone who isn't just kind of a technical lawyer. That's really the question we should be asking. And to me, I think the answer gives itself. We should build a legal order where those who commit the worst violations don't actually get to benefit from the legal order that they are very badly undermining. Now, let me say a few things about the economics. Again, I think Maxim has covered all the important points. I think he's right. One thing maybe I would add as an economist is this word assets is not one that people often know exactly what it means. It sounds like it means money. I think it's useful for everyone to be clear about what these assets are. So they're not what I call the treasure chest fallacy. This is not sort of gold and jewels in a pirate's treasure chest that's buried somewhere and we're fighting about who gets to hold the key. Or, can we open it and take it? The assets are, on the whole, Russian central bank deposit accounts in our central banks, and mostly Russian central bank holdings of government bonds from Western governments. So it's basically IOUs from us to the Russian central bank. So the question we're asking really, should we be honoring those given what Russia has done, or should we direct those funds we would otherwise ultimately pay to Russia to Ukraine instead? Economically, that's what we're talking about. So I think that's kind of a useful thing to have in mind. I completely agree with Maxim's assessment that there's very little risk to the international reserve system from a confiscation. But I'll nuance it a little bit. I think in the short run, there's no risk at all. And he showed, and we've seen that when the blocking happened in late February, early March 2022, we have seen no effect on central bank managers from non-Western countries trying to pull their money out. It just hasn't happened. And I think he showed that, if anything, the tiny renminbi share has fallen a little bit. Now, There was another point where you might have thought this would happen, which was this year when the G7 leaders for the first time said, we will not give access back to the Russian central bank until they pay compensation. That was a further step. That was saying, we are actually going to force you to use this money in a certain way, even though we're not doing it yet. At least that was a policy statement. That too, there was no effect on it, on central bank reserve managers' behavior. Now, where maybe we differ a little bit is, I think, in the long run, there is a possibility that the international reserve system will be diversified, that at least many countries will, in a sense, follow Russia's track and shift some of their reserves into renminbi, maybe gold. But there are two reasons why that is not really something we should worry about, even if, and I think this is possible, that process is speeded up a bit by what we might do by confiscating. One reason is that it would happen anyway, to the extent that China is clearly now a big part of the global economy. Other emerging countries are also becoming big parts of the global economy. An increasing share of trade is between those economies. It's perfectly logical that they would want to diversify both the currency that they trade and transact in and the currency they keep their reserves in. So it's very natural that renminbi should grow over time. The other point is why we shouldn't worry about this. It would happen anyway. The other reason is that the one country that cannot do this, put its reserves in renminbi, is China. Right? Reserves are about your claims on other countries. You can't have reserves in your own currency, then they're not reserves. So the one country which is the biggest holder of foreign reserves will not do this, right? We know that. What could happen perhaps is that the countries that have accumulated a lot of reserves, which happened in part because of past financial crises where they realized they needed big reserves in case of sudden stops in capital flows, maybe we'll go into a world where countries say, well, maybe we don't need such big reserves, and we'll scale things down. Is that a bad thing? The standard view among economists was that it was the rise in reserves, the very big reserves, that created instability because it created imbalances. This was certainly one reason why people thought the global financial crisis, or it helped the global financial crisis happen. So, smaller reserves would not be a bad thing for global financial stability. Ultimately, the worst thing that could happen, it seems, to Western countries is that, maybe they would have to pay slightly more to borrow funds to fund their deficits from surplus countries in the emerging markets. It's a marginal change, and it's one that's far out there anyway, and that would probably happen no matter what, if it does happen. So what are we left with? We're left with not very serious economic consequences, maybe none at all. So far, none at all. And the one thing we haven't talked about, which we need to talk about, is what are the economic effects of not acting? They are partly the unforeseeable but bad economic effects of a worse legal order, a more insecure legal order. But more directly, they are that somebody else will have to pay for Ukrainian reconstruction. We have seen the difficulties of mustering funds in the tens of billions. We see that now today in Brussels. We see it in DC, this month. What we need to raise is hundreds of billions. Of course, the West could pay this. It's not it's a few percent of annual Western GDP, but it's politically very hard. And in any case, we know that Russia is the country that should be paying it. The consequence of not confiscating economically would either be a much higher burden on Western taxpayers and a much bigger political strain using political capital to make this happen, or that the money isn't forthcoming, in which case we would be making the mistake that the US did not make after the Second World War when they went for Marshall aid. It would condemn Ukraine to misery. It would have a very significant and negative effect on the war effort, on Ukraine's chances of winning. All of that would cause huge political and economic damage to especially Europe, but the West in general. Those are the consequences of not doing this. So in all the economic debates, we always need to look at the other side of the balance. So all of this is in line with what both Andriy and Maxim have said. I wanted to add those perspectives and how they feed into what I see the political discussion as being. There's more to say, in particular, about the sort of smaller attempt that now being made about the taxing the profits on the reserves, but I'm sure we'll get to that. But I'll stop there. Very good work. Thanks for letting me comment. It's very important. So I hope everyone kind of takes this away and reads it.
Martin, thank you so much. Yes, indeed. I mean, the problem does look mostly political. And I think the urgency they mention is not only about like the outcome of presidential election in the US, but also the outcome of the war itself. The longer we wait, probably there will be not really much of Ukraine left to pay compensations for. That's a very unfortunate outcome, but this is something the probability of it has unfortunately increased recently. And the hypocrisy of international law, if you say, I mean, probably it's a strong word, but we could see it not only in the financial sector, but also the UN Security Council, where Russia still is able to block decisions. And this is beats the purpose of this institution. So obviously the international law looks like it needs to be changed. It's not carved in stone. There need to be some changes which would make such situations impossible, so that the rogue actors or the aggressor states cannot benefit from it. But I think this is like really rather a longer-term perspective. This is not what Ukraine can really hope to achieve in a short run. Ukraine needs money for its military, it needs money to reconstruct already on the go, because there is a lot of damage permanently. And, okay, we do not have legal changes in international law soon. Governments in many Western countries seem to lack political will to really, deliver on the promises on what they say that Russia will pay eventually, not specifying when and how this will exactly be carried out. What can be the second best solution in the situation? How can we realistically expect things to shift and the money to be channeled to Ukraine rather sooner than later? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Is that for me, Olga?
Yeah, Martin, I think that's for you, and then probably people, yes, and Andriy also raised his hand, so he would also comment, I guess.
I'll give my thoughts and then pass it to the others. But first, one quick comment on what you said. I know I said we can change international law. Let's not take it for granted that it needs to be changed. I think my sort of view as a informed layperson is that international law is maybe a bit unspecified, underdefined in this area, and what we are doing is to specify, refine. So I don't want to accidentally accept the premise that it would be against international law to do this. My understanding is that it's not, and that's what Andriy has argued too. But there are legal disputes clearly, so it's not fully specified clearly. What are the alternatives? Look, let me mention two. So one is what is now happening and may be decided this week actually. So for very long there has been this proposal not to confiscate the assets, but to make use of the phrase that is used is the proceeds of the frozen, or we should say immobilized, central bank foreign exchange reserves. I don't want to get too technical here, but most of the Russian central bank's reserves are in the form of securities, government bonds, and so on, as I mentioned, and they tend to be, the standard practice is that these are held in something called central securities depositories, basically sort of banks for bonds, if you like. So it's not like in the old days where you hold these paper certificates that says the government of France promises to pay and so on. This is all electronic, and it's managed through central institutions. And the biggest one is the institution called Euroclear that's resident in Belgium. So about 200 billion euros worth of Russian central bank assets are housed there and kind of managed there. Now, because access to them is blocked, but these are bonds that pay cash payments, they pay interest rates, and when they come to maturity, they are repaid in cash. That has been happening. So the German government, the French government, probably the US government, the UK government have been honoring these bonds. So they've been turned into cash, but that cash has been stuck at Euroclear. Euroclear is probably paying 0% on those cash balances to Russia, because these are, if you think about your own investment account in a bank, the cash bit of it probably pays 0. But the cash that's been accumulating, Euroclear will have put in on safe deposit, probably with the central banks of those currencies. And as we all know, interest rates have gone up. So up to 4%, 5%, depending on the currency. So there's a spread between 0 and 4 and 5 that's creating huge profits for Euroclear. So the proposal is, let's take a windfall tax, let's use 100% of that and channel it towards Ukraine. We're talking much less money. Euroclear made 3 billion euros up until the end of the third quarter this year. So maybe it'll be 4 billion for the year. Maybe it'll be a little bit more per year from now on. Much less money, but money that can be taken. But it's not Russian money. It's very important to be clear about this. This is not a way of getting at some Russian state assets. This is money that is legally Euroclear's money. It's just that it's made it on the back of these policies. So it's fair to tax 100% of them. I think that's going to happen because it's the path of least resistance. But I think, one, it's far too little, and two, it's politically a little bit dangerous because it's seen as doing the job. It's seen as, okay, you know, we've used now Russian assets in the way we can. Well, actually, we haven't. And by going for the bit that are not owned by Russia, we have, I think, at least politically reinforced what I think is the wrong premise, that we can't legally touch what belongs legally to Russia. So I actually find this very problematic. You know, it's good if we can get another 10 billion to Ukraine every year, or 5 or whatever it is, better than nothing. But it may well actually make it less likely that we do the right thing and confiscate the whole assets. You know, I've spent a long time, so I can come to another alternative in a bit, but maybe let's get to the others too.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Andrei, please, you, I think, want to add something on this.
Yeah, I'd like to add some points. Thank you, Martin. I'd like to tell that Martin is completely right, that what is proposed is not a proposal to change international law. It's completely within the frameworks of the existing international law, existing international customary law, which is flexible and depends on state practice and state understanding of what the behavior is right. So this is not violating existing international law at all. But what shall be changed is the approach of states to the reparations and the forms of its payments, because currently there are 2 recognized ways of paying reparation by aggressor. It's like signing a treaty when the aggressor state is defeated in war and ideally is occupied, and it signs a treaty for paying reparations. And another way is establishing the claim commission, according to which, well, the state is forced, aggressor state, perpetrator state is forced to pay some amount of money for example, for its profits from international trade, as it happened with the Iraq after its conflict with Kuwait in 1991, and Iraq was forced to pay 1% annually from its oil exports profits, and Iraq, of course, could refuse, but Iraq understood that in case of refusal, it will be like killed by international sanctions, and it will be totally destroyed by the joint efforts of the international community. When we're talking about Russia, we should understand that it's the unprecedented aggressor we're dealing with. It's since 1945. It's let's be realistic. It doesn't look likely currently that Russia shall be directly defeated in war very soon, and it shall be occupied, for example, by Ukraine. It's also very unrealistic that Russia is may be forced by international community to pay any interests from its exports. There are no effective instruments capable currently to force Russia to do something on the international level, either by the United Nations or by any other international organization or the international community in a whole. And we must understand that in case of Russia, our approach to reparations must be changed. It must be more flexible, and such reparations should be paid much earlier, because Ukraine needs money not just for reconstruction. Ukraine needs money for survival. In case this procedure is being so much delayed, there may be no state to restore, and there may be no state to help, because obviously Russia has much more resources in this war, and so we are still staying just based on the help, the aid from our distinguished partners. And directing such money belonging to the aggressor would be very helpful for Ukraine, first for the military purposes, and then for the reconstruction of the economy. And another one is about the windfall tax. Actually, we understand that it's a great proposal, and we would be grateful for any, I mean Ukraine. Ukraine would be grateful for any aid from the international partners. But we must understand that windfall tax is considering the scale of the damages. I'm sorry, but it's not shall not seriously decide any problems with the Ukraine is facing currently, because currently there are 425 billion US dollars actually calculated damages and losses in Ukraine. When we're talking about Russian sovereign assets, we're talking about 300 billion. So even the whole amount of Russian sovereign assets will not, as of today, cover all the needs of Ukraine for reconstruction, for damages. And while the war still continues, unfortunately, such damages and losses will continue as well. So we would be grateful, but I think it would be not fair and not right to make such windfall tax and its direction to Ukraine as the only instrument of aid. As additional, as supplementary, yeah, okay, that would be great. But full confiscation of Russian assets should not be put off the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrei, very much. Okay, but what are the really main reasons for this lack of political will? Maxim, I have a question. Maybe there are some other dimensions of economic relations which are still crucial. You know, Russia being a major energy exporter comes to mind. Can this account for this lack of will on the part of some of the Western countries to be more straightforward and support confiscation? Do you think this is an important dimension to think of, to take into account while talking about the issue?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. This is definitely a huge issue. And even a few years ago, we saw a significant degree of dependence of the West on Russian energy exports. And thankfully, over the past few years, we have seen a significant decrease as well. But at the same time, we still see that a few countries continue to pretty heavily rely on Russian energy, and we see that even though the European Union and the US have implemented sanctions against all major types of Russian energy exports, there are still some exemptions because certain countries still are having a hard time transitioning from that. So obviously, from a lot of stakeholders, especially certain political groups in the West, there is a concern that a complete elimination of Russian economy of Russia is going to harm the economic activity in the West, and I think this is going to be addressed, and this is already being addressed by the diversification of the energy inputs, by switching to other countries, and also obviously by the transition to more sustainable energy sources, which is definitely not going to happen overnight, but long term, all of this I think is going to help mitigate the risks to the economic activity in the West from the lack of Russian energy imports.
Thank you. Martin, there is some question on clarifying what you said about proceeds considered to be Euroclear's assets, and what about other proceeds not of Euroclear? Is it clearly confirmed that this is the case? And also maybe you want to expand on some other parts of solution which you see, if you have anything to add.
Just on the, sorry, I was just trying to read the question myself as well to make sure I understood it.
Yeah.
Let me just, so addressing the thing about the proceeds, there's no doubt that we're talking about the proceeds of Euroclear. This is profits on Euroclear's profit and loss statement, and they're reporting it. They're quite good at putting up, you look at their quarterly reports online, it's all there. Go to Euroclear, look it up, and they'll say every quarter they have an update, and they say, well, now here is our balance sheet, it's grown. Here we separate out how much is normal business as usual and how much is due to the fact that Russia cannot access its reserves held with us. And they report how much extra income they've had because of this increase in the balance sheet. So there's no doubt about this. This is, and if you look at, the Commission hasn't published much about this, but you look at internal documents and so on, the stuff that's been leaked to the press, it's also very clear that the entire construction of the policy has to do with touching things that are not Russia's legal property. So there's no doubt about this. I think you had another question, but let me just stop there.
Yeah, so we have a comment by Michael Landesman, and I'm just thinking maybe, Michael, you want to just talk about it. Can we allow Michael talk?
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm unmuted, I think.
Yeah, we hear you. It's all fine, yeah.
No, well, I take all the arguments which were made, which go in the direction that there are, on balance, really no legal arguments against confiscation. And as Martin and Maxim was pointing out, little economic arguments. So they were, you were all saying it's politics, yeah, but without actually analyzing where the political hesitancy comes from. I mean, what's the underlying? And I guess there is differentiated positions of the US and different European countries, yeah, or the EU, and within that, different European countries in their stance of that. So what I'm missing is, in a way, the sort of positive analysis of what really drives the political stances, yeah, of Western hesitancy. And on the other thing, on the economic side, I think Martin already mentioned that there are sort of underlying trends, yeah, where let's say Western currencies are gradually probably changing their dominant positions, yeah, in reserve. And I think there is an element, of course, of a speeding up of some of these trends, yeah. I mean, there is more transaction, partly as a result of the war, going on indirectly, paying in that certain trades which wouldn't, without the war, necessarily have shifted towards being traded in Chinese currency, which have moved more in this direction. Of course, and once you trade in Chinese currency, you also better hold reserves in Chinese currency. So there is a link between reserve holding and the move towards trading. And I think some of these trends have been speeding up. And probably the last point I wanted to make is, well, the legal arguments, I think, for us are very straightforward about violating international law. But from a political perception, in terms of the growing, let's say, gap between the so-called global north and the south, yeah, this perception is not necessarily seen in the same way. Probably legally, it could be stated, but I think in terms of the actual perception in quite a lot of the southern countries, they would not necessarily interpret the law in political terms in the same way, or as a clear definition of an aggressor, etc. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, all the valid points. I think. Who would like to respond? Martin, would you like to start, please?
Yeah, all very valid points and good questions. So I just want to share my reactions to them. I'll try very briefly to make kind of 3 points on the politics and 3 on the economics very quickly. My sense of the politics. So three things that may have made a difference. One is that there's a difference between lawyers who work for a government and lawyers who work outside a government. And the tendency seems to be that government lawyers are, part of their job is to be more conservative. You see this very clearly in the EU, which, of course, the whole construct is a body of law, right? That's what the European Union is. It's a construction of law. And you have an extremely independent court that will strike down anything that isn't legally based. So it's kind of natural. You see it in the US too, where it's been the legal community. My reading is that the lawyers for the Treasury in the White House and so on are the ones who have been cautious because that's their job, whereas the ones outside have been freer to make these bolder arguments. So, you know, that's some of it. That's one part of it, and that obviously affects what politicians and in particular bureaucrats hear. The second, maybe even more important political point is about coordination, and Maxime was touching on this. Even if the economic consequences aren't very great, it is clear that acting unilaterally for a single country, there could very well be big consequences. So I think the most obvious example here is Belgium. If Belgium acted completely unilaterally, it would probably kill a lot of Euroclear's business. Not because people would take their reserves out of euros or dollars, but they may try to find a securities depository in a jurisdiction with a less aggressive government. So there's clearly a collective action problem here. And Maxime is right. The answer is you act together. But that is politically complicated. So a lot of what's going on, as I understand it from people I talk to, is that you have in particular between Europe and the US, some, you know, a bit of friction about, you know, you go first, after you, no, after you. It's a little bit of that. Of course, everyone has to jump together. Some maybe resentment in Europe that the US would be happy for Europe to do this, but they will never do anything that endangers the role of the dollar. And of course, the political process inside each government may be moving at different speeds. Although I think everyone is moving in the same direction, that it's becoming harder and harder to raise money from Ukraine domestically, and there is this huge pot of money here. Maybe we should look at it in pure political terms. The last political point, very briefly, just because it's sometimes raised, some countries have issues with the concept of reparations or not giving too much support to the very concept of reparations. Germany in particular, for historical reasons and for the fact that claims keep being made against it, whether political or legal. So what I hear is that Germany has a particular problem with exactly how much legal precedent one sets that comes back to haunt yourself afterwards. It's easier to have these discussions when you talk about compensation than reparations. I'll leave it to the lawyers to talk about how different they may be, but this is my sense. I was going to say that obviously the politics are also driven by the perception of the economic consequences. So I was going to say a little bit more about that, but I'm taking so long that I will pause. And Olga, I'll let you tell me when you want me to talk about those.
Yeah, thank you. I think Andrei also wants to add something. Please, Andrei, raise your hand. You can talk now.
Thank you very much. I would like to answer the comments regarding the legal issues. As I see in our Q&A session, that panelists cannot explicitly address legal and economic arguments against the confiscation of Russian assets. Look, actually the issue here is that as of current moment, there is no official legal position against confiscation issued and sounded by European Union. Why is confiscation of Russian assets not legally possible? All the arguments against confiscation due to international law we know from experts and from their papers. The main argument is, of course, the sovereign immunity concept. That states and their property, they have immunity from alienation, seizure by courts of the foreign state, which is confirmed by the ICJ practice, namely in the 2012 case on Germany against Italy, and so on. But these are just the expert position. We have heard just statements of the EU leadership. This is very complicated. This is very difficult, and this is legally very, very hard to implement. We have heard about the working group, which is making some official statements, some official reports, but nobody has ever, as of today, seen this official position of why it is not legally possible. As we are talking about USA and Canada, their position is directly another, but we really need the official EU position to debate with, because EU role in this procedure is exclusive. It's the major, because like the majority of money is placed in European Union and in Euroclear. So as for your comment that we have not analyzed, unfortunately, we have not yet anything to address on the official level, and we are looking forward to such official positions to make an analysis and to make the official debates regarding it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there is also one more question in the chat, which we need to address. I think quite important aspect. ECB's and another central bank position towards this, and that it's material for decision making. But in terms of political will, or rather the lack of it, I mean, is there this elephant in the room, just Kremlin having strong influence and connections to some of the countries? Is it a really, like, you know, big part of the story? Marta, maybe you want to touch upon whatever you want as ECB, or, you know, or both?
Yes, let me touch on this, because it dovetails with what I was going to say earlier. Part of the politics is that there are political perception, or politicians' perceptions of what the economic consequences will be, which may not be the same as ours or the expert ones. I mean, I happen to think that they're mistaken. So I think some of that is the case of the ECB. It's true that there are these trends of moving into other currencies for reserves, or diversifying reserves, as I also said, and it could well be speeded up. But what are we talking about? We're talking about, you know, maybe something that would happen anyway, happening 5 years earlier. I think the question we need to ask, you know, so what for the West? What would, you know, whatever the damage is, it may not be much damage from you know, other countries holding as many reserves, but if there is, just the fact that it happens a few years earlier, you know, it's marginal. But the Europe has a bit of a, I think, greater sensitivity to this for two reasons. One is there is a stated policy. There's always been a desire for the euro to at least match, if not replace, dethrone the dollar in as the major international reserve currency, or a major international reserve currency. And it is, by, you know, clearly the second, but a distant second in many ways. And it may be true that everything that's happened since February 2022 makes it a bit harder to reach that goal, partly because Russia was actually diversifying from dollars into euros. So that was kind of good for the international role of the euro, but only insofar as we think that Europe would not want to be aligned with the US, that there isn't Western unity on these sanctions and reactions to breaches of international law like Russia's. The other reason is that the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone, I think, have left quite deep political scars. And there is a worry about anything that might make European government debt unsafe again. So I think those things play in. I think those are very overstated concerns. Even if they were legitimate concerns in their own right, you have to weigh them against, as I said, the cost of doing nothing. And I think the balance is clear. But in order to explain the politics, and the ECB in particular, I think it comes from that. My impression is that actually the ECB may be getting a bit more nuanced. But I think there's a bit of a central banker's kind of instinctive reaction to, you know, don't touch anything, because who knows how things could be destabilized. It's a little bit their job. Plus, there is a little bit, I think, of kind of solidarity, professional solidarity between central bankers. The Russian central bank was extremely well respected. The governor was extremely well respected in the global central banking community. they all have, accounts with one another, the central banks do. So probably there's a bit of a déformation professionnelle going on to a small extent. Let me add one last thing. I think there are people who worry that confiscating would, cause damage to Russia at some point in a bad way, like reparations forced on Germany after Versailles killed the Weimar Republic. Right? I call it Versailles syndrome. So I think that exists in Europe, that there's a sense of history that says you should not enforce reparations. Nobody can say that at the moment because it would be a bad thing to say, but I think it's being thought. I think it's also a big mistake. And the easiest way to see the mistake is to consider that the reparations that Germany was supposed to pay after the First World War, it would have to extract from its own economy, and that would have stopped growth, and that's why it never happened. The Russian central bank reserves are already there, right? They were saved up in the past. It would not require anything to the Russian economy to take them or to give them up to pay for compensation. We can have a discussion about how much they could be reasonably expected to pay in the future. But again, it's a surplus economy still today. They're still making surpluses. They've made maybe 200 billion since the start of the full-scale war on unsanctioned oil and gas sales. So, it's not Germany 1919 this. It's a country with a lot of spare money that is, to the extent they access it, is now used to kill Ukrainians or worse. And if it wasn't, would be sitting there and could be taken without causing damage to the economy itself.
Thank you, Martin. Just one brief point. I think a 5 years window can be quite crucial in real political terms, because that's some, election cycle for some of the politicians. But I see that Maxim also wants to add to this. Please, Maxim.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add a quick point with regards to the comment that the confiscation can alienate the South and widen the gap between the West and the South. I think the real question should be whether the gap is going to be widened if we actually don't do the confiscation, don't proceed with the confiscation, because the red thread within our research was that not confiscating Russian assets will basically give a carte blanche to other countries, authoritarian countries, dictators, who will potentially want to also break the international law and not suffer the consequences. So in that sense, but you can't really say a collapse of the Western civilization, that's a bit too big, but the divide is going to widen just because the southern countries, the countries in the global south, will no longer feel obligated to adhere to the international order. And in that sense, those threads are going to be broken between the two. So I think it should really be seen from that perspective rather.
Well, thank you. And I think we can observe already some beginning of this trend with Venezuela threatening taking over parts of Ghana, I think, if I remember correctly. Yeah, this will definitely empower potential, wannabe dictators or existing dictators to go all in. I think, well, there is a question about possible Russia's reaction. I'm not sure we have space to touch upon it, because we discussed to a large extent all this, I think. But I think we have no space for the last comments. If anyone wants to add from you some comments addressing maybe Russia's reaction, if you want. Yeah, just briefly, and then we will wrap it up. Michael, I see your hand now. Do you want to make a comment?
Well, I just probably two comments. One is actually the question which you just didn't want to address. There is, of course, still the possibility of there are Western assets in Russia, yeah, and quite probably important companies still present there, and Putin is quite asset by asset deciding what to do with it. So I think there is a retaliatory element in that, which might also play a role depending on the lobbying power of these groups they have in the countries. But I also wanted to deviate a little bit from Martin's view that, well, what is it better? The trends are going in this direction. But I think there is, probably as a result of this conflict, possibly also with the Middle Eastern conflict also playing a role of really a much more entrenched direction of regional bloc formations here. And I think, I guess some of the hesitancy by at least multilateralists or and also guardians of international financial system is to be worried about that. Yeah, that given that there is a very strong trading bloc, and I mean even some of the oil and gas trades with the Middle East and China and so on are going to are moving much more strongly in the direction of being denominated in other currencies. That this regional bloc formation is, or the worry about the regional bloc formation is also a bit of a, and probably a justified worry in state departments and in foreign policy actors, yeah, internationally. So I wouldn't put such a low weight on these issues, which I think over the last, since the war and probably slightly before that, also with the tensions between US and China, have really started to develop a much more fragmented global picture with quite strong economic and political consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, these are all serious questions to think about. The question is whether not confiscating the assets would be helpful in the long run, or rather would actually exacerbate the existing trends. And I think we have a last round of comments. Andrei has already raised his hand, so you will be first, and then yeah.
Thank you very much. I would just like to comment regarding the retaliation part of the previous comment. Actually, this retaliation of Russia against Western companies which made business in Russia has already started, even much before the Russian assets have been confiscated. In April 2023, Russia presidential administration of Russia issued an order by which authorized its government to put the assets of companies which are originated from countries which are so-called hostile to Russia, and where Russia as a state and Russian citizens are deprived of their property rights. Actually, the Russian government may in response put the assets of such companies into so-called temporary management, and so they have already made such moves. The assets of the Uniper company, oil and gas company from Germany, the assets of the Fortum company from Finland, Amedia booking companies, if I'm not mistaken, or editing a company from Norway, the shares of Carlsberg, and also the Danone company, or French company, a dairy company. Their assets have been put into the temporary management of the state. It's worth mentioning that these companies, they negotiated their exit from the Russian market. They were even ready to pay the exit fee, so-called. But anyway, their shares and their assets have been arrested, and without any confiscation. And after this, we also should know that Kyiv School of Economics is making analysis and is looking for the process of Western companies dealing on the Russian market. And as of today, more than half of such companies have either exited the Russian market or suspended activities, or are on other final ways to stop their business in Russia. And those which are still doing business in Russia, I think they should be aware of the risks, because there are already precedents when the assets are actually nationalized, they without any confiscation or without any compensation. I'm sorry, they put into temporary management. And I would like to mention once more that this is all happening right now. It's happening since April. prior to any confiscation of assets, of Russian assets, we are talking about. So I don't think that confiscation of assets will really have a big impact on such retaliation, which is already happening nowadays. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. And very short final comments, Maxim, Martin, just 2 minutes because we really ran out of time. Maxim, would you like to give a comment?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that is just worth mentioning, and that also addresses some of the questions that we heard before, is that once again, the gap between the two might widen, but the West has an advantage of being able to stick together and work together, because in the Global South, there is a much, much smaller chance of the countries actually trying to form a cohesive common policy, just because of the vast differences in the geopolitical interests between African countries, China, India, etc. So the West definitely has an advantage, and the power, the financial power, to actually form a policy and hold the world order together. So in that sense, I think it is a huge chance, and the confiscation can be an instrument that will also achieve multiple other geopolitical goals for the West.
Thank you so much. Martin?
Thank you, and it's been a great discussion. Just very briefly on Michael Landesmann's point, Andrei pointed out that, of course, the confiscations are already happening. In fact, Russia is already using countermeasures doctrine illegitimately, but it's already in use. I think we need to consider these private assets lost, write them off already. I'm sure Michael is right that it could be a political explanation, that there are powerful lobbies that put their pressure on their governments. But in terms of what a good public policy is for our citizens and our countries, even if we lose those, or Western owners lose those companies, the difference in amounts are just orders of magnitude, single or tens of billions on one side and hundreds of billions on the other side. So I think that's worth keeping in mind if we want to assess what is a good policy, as opposed to just explaining why some of the hesitation may happen, but for bad reasons. So I'll finish on this point about the breakup of the multilateral system, multilateral trading or economic system. Of course, this is not new, and it's not caused by the war, and I don't think Michael was indicating anything else, but I wrote about the formation of regional blocs back in 2018, 2019, for reasons to do with geopolitics and climate and how to deal with climate and so on, and data privacy, all these things. So there are deep economic forces at work here in the direction of regional blocs anyway. I don't think that the confiscation question makes that much difference. It's in a sense almost a symptom as much as it would be a contributor. In any case, it would at most speed up something that's already happening. But again, we need to look at the other side of it. And I think it's a very big mistake to try to think of the multilateral economic system as something separate from the multilateral order in general. I think it's conceptually wrong, but it's also a mistake to think that we can save a multilateral trading order if we can't save basic respect for the UN Charter, for example. So we need to see all of this in the round. And the question we need to ask is, if we think that going towards regional blocs rather than proper multilateral globalization is a bad direction, it may well be, does Ukraine's victory or Ukraine's defeat contribute more to going in that direction? And it seems to me that Ukraine losing is a much greater danger in going in that fragmented world direction than Ukraine's victory would be, because it would enforce that part of the world that has always tried to enforce precisely that multilateral order. And it's a war fought on Ukraine's right to be part of that multilateral democratic order, ultimately. So that's where we need to see this question. It's not, is confiscation bad or not for globalized trading? It's as part of a policy to influence both the outcome of the war and the shape of the peace, a prosperous Ukraine within Europe, what is better for the multilateral order? And again, I think once you ask the question that way, the answer is obvious.
Thank you, Maria. This is like very important point. I also was thinking about the ultimate, stakes in this game, and it's about Ukraine's future in the end, which is crucial, which we want to be able to influence in a direction beneficial for both Ukraine and the international order. Thank you so much for such an interesting discussion. We have been recording it later. The video will be put on YouTube, so it will be in the public access. I hope our discussion will contribute to the things moving in the way we want to move, and that the confiscation of Russian assets will happen rather sooner than later. Thank you so much, and take care. Bye bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.